Now we have the connection to Popper. Although Friedman never cites Popper in 53, its connection to Popper's philosophy are well known. Some people even go so far, one author claimed, but this is controversial, the methodology of positive economics established falsificationism as the dominant methodology in economic research as far as the self-perception of economic economists was concerned. This is how he sees it. When I cited that in the paper that was refused by the journal, they said, oh, that's not right. Okay, this is Kepler's view. This is at least one author. Whether that's really true, but certainly it's so that Popper occurs also not cited in the paper. There are indeed various elements in F53 apparently taken directly out of Popper's logic of scientific discovery. I go through them very quickly to give a short list of topics, not explaining it any longer. So theory testing by predictions lead to tentative acceptance of rejection or rejection. This is a Popper topic. Or evidence for hypothesis is repeated failure to contradict it. These are the page numbers there in F53. Then general theory must have implications susceptible to empirical contradiction. Popper. Science is a body of tentatively accepted generalizations. This is really Popper. Fundamental methodological principle hypothesis can only be tested by its implications. That's Popper and already in John Stuart Mill. Any theory is necessarily provisional. That's pure Popper. And construction of hypothesis must be discussed in psychological, not logical categories. Pure Popper. You find everything of that in the logic of scientific discovery. Okay, now there's a problem. The historical puzzle is this. F53 appeared in 1953, and Popper's English edition of his book appeared only in 1959. Right? The original German edition appeared in 1934, but Friedman did not read German. So how is it possible that so much Popper is in there? Is that a coincidence, or what's going on there? Again, one got to find historical traces, and there's a solution in an interview which Friedman in 1992 gave, put on the web in 2012, in which one sentence is, one of the major benefits that I personally derived from the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. Mont Pelerin Society still exists. It's the liberal economists meeting there, and the first meeting was in 47. Hayek and Knight were the founding fathers, Hayek mostly, and they met there. Okay. And there he met and meeting Karl Popper and having an opportunity for some long discussions with him, not on economic policy at all, but on methodology in the social sciences and in the physical sciences. So he talked to Popper over hours. That conversation played a not negligible role in a later essay of mine, The Methodology of Positive Economics. This is where the Popper comes from, and this is why it's not cited, because he didn't read Popper, right? He couldn't. The stuff that was out in English was not on methodology, Open Society and its enemies and so on, Elend des Historicisms, whatever. He hasn't read that. He had discussed with Popper. He's intelligent enough to understand after 2 hours what that stuff is there. He got that and put it in the paper, right? This was then 47. 6 years later, this paper came out. So he had Popper in the back of his mind. He had Max Weber in the back of his mind. Never cites them, but they play a very, very important role. Now, let's see why is this Popper role so important. Why was Popper's philosophy important to Friedman? And there are two answers. The standard answer would be this one. The superficial answer would be F53 tries to assimilate economics to physics, and Popper's philosophy is meant to be a philosophy of physics. So what Friedman says is, wonderful, I take this philosophy, apply it to economics, and here we go. All right. That may not be false, but here's the much more profound answer, which is really important, I think, that the introduction of ideal types in order to formulate hypotheses for some type of economic situation is not empirically controlled, is highly hypothetical or even speculative. So when Friedman says, let's treat this situation, say the cigarette industry, and let's assume it's purely monopolistic, this is a speculation, right? That's absolutely empirically unbounded. It's just that you as a theoretician say, oh, look at that situation. That really feels as if only competition plays a role, right? So by using ideal type methodology and abstracting from the other ideal types that are in principle involved, and just putting, everything on one ideal type, this is highly speculative. And if you've got something so speculative, you need strong empirical control, whether that's justified of what you're doing. And this is what Popper delivers, right? He just delivers that sort of empirical control. Because he's so aware, Friedman is so aware, I mean, he really knows what he's doing. He's really very, very, very clever. Never underestimate Friedman. Even if he says things you think that are idiotic, don't underestimate him. He's really clever. He's knowing exactly what he's doing, and he's seeing that by the ideal type methodology, we are introducing a speculative element that may be completely wrong. So what we need is really empirical control, and this is exactly what the testing stuff by Popper delivers. So you introduce these speculative elements, they are possibly fruitful, but then you look whether they work by looking what are the empirical consequences, the predictions. This is what he's doing. Okay, we make the break here, 5 minutes, and then we come to the final issue, whether that is instrumentalism or not. All right, let us continue here, and I finally come to what I already hinted at, the question of instrumentalism, but I really want to nail it now that you see what the question is, or what the position is here concerning instrumentalism in Friedman. Now, what we have to assess is the status of economic hypotheses and theories, according to Friedman, of course, according to their character as realist or instrumentalist. This is the question, and this is the main alternative how Friedman is discussed, which I find is a very unfortunate way of discussing it, but anyway, this is how it historically developed, and I show you now what the answer here is. And the answer is now, to get that correct again, what realism and instrumentalism is: do these economic hypotheses and theories claim to represent reality, or are they mere instruments for prediction without any claim to realistically represent the system in question? That's the alternative between realism and instrumentalism. And now, for Friedman, economic hypotheses contain assumptions, in scare quotes, that are descriptively false but analytically relevant, because usually it's just one ideal type that figures in them, and from the rest is abstracted or even then substituted. Now, I have distinguished two types of assumptions: falsities due to abstraction and idealization. That was the case of free fall or perfect competition, right? You abstract and then you get these ideal cases. But also the second type, falsities due to abstraction and substitutions, namely the differential equation solving billiard ball player and the rationally calculating manager. And we're going to discuss these two things, because the second one really feels a little instrumentalist, at least stronger than the first one, and we've got to discuss these possibilities here. Now, in economics, this is what Friedman claims: both types are assumptions. Both types of assumptions are ideal types. For instance, perfect competition, this is a pure idealization, and rational behavior of management, this is a substitution, but also in a sense an ideal type regarding the results of their behavior. Now, using these ideal types in hypotheses implies the claim that they represent, even in their idealized form, the truly relevant factors in the given problem. This is the idea of real types, right? The analysis of real types into ideal types, and then you can say, oh, these are the fundamental things. The stuff that I'm looking at is a composite of these two, but for certain situations, I can omit one of them or two of them, depending, and just look at one of them. This is what he's saying. This is what economists are doing, and therefore they can solve problems, right? Of course, this claim must be substantiated by successful predictions. You are not legitimized to do that, but just saying, oh, it's simpler to do it this way. No, you've got to get the right predictions. Otherwise, it's, of course, nonsense what you're doing. All right. Now, in the first case of falsity by omission and idealization, one real factor is highlighted and idealized. Competition, for instance. There is competition in this situation, but you do in economics, you just say, well, that's the only factor that I take, on board, and I abstract from the rest, and for a given problem, that's good enough, right? So you take out the most important factor. The same you do in the law of free fall, right? You just say, oh, I only take gravity and I idealize it. That's good enough for certain situations, not for other situations. This is what they're doing. So other factors are neglected, okay? In this case, of course, the ideal type approach is clearly realistic. because the pertinent ideal type directly targets real factors, right? You're saying, yes, there is competition. Of course it is there. There are other factors as well, but I don't take them into account, but I take the most important factor into account. Same in free fall. There are other forces, yeah, but I don't care about them. The most important force that's really explaining the phenomenon or driving the phenomenon, that's gravity, and that's on board. Therefore, that's purely realistic, right? And just saying, yeah, I'm simplifying, yes, but what's the rest is real. It's really there. It's really the stuff that does the work that produces the phenomenon. So, now this is more difficult in the second case, namely falsity by omission and substitution. Because one real factor is highlighted and substituted by another factor that is, in a credible way, functionally equivalent to the real factor. Right? This was the second situation, optimized behavior in billiard or in management, substituted by behavior based on rational calculations. So you introduce something that does not exist, right? That's not real. Therefore, you may say, oops, what about realism in this case? Now, in this case, the ideal type approach has admittedly an instrumentalist flavor, quite clearly, because you use something that's useful, but it's untrue, right? The billiard player doesn't calculate, the manager doesn't calculate. You introduce it, why? Well, it's a practical instrument, right, to analyze the situation. So certainly there's an instrumentalist flavor in it. But full instrumentalism treats the real system as a black box and tries to model the relevant behavior, typically input-output relations, by whatever means. The only evaluative standard is predictive success. And that's not the case in the substitution case, because you have an argument why your substitute has the same results as the original thing. It only can be treated, right? You cannot really, the psychology of billiard ball players is pretty complicated and probably different from case to case, what people do. But you can substitute it by rationality, and then you get the same results. So you're not doing something, completely arbitrary, and you don't care, but you say, well, it's a different mechanism, but the results are the same. And the results are the real results, right? So, which you then controlled by the predictions, right? So in Friedman's examples, a part of the real system is substituted by something else for whose functional equivalence arguments have to be given, although finally predictions are decisive. So this goes beyond what pure instrumentalism does, because in instrumentalism you do not care at all. You just say, does it predict correctly or doesn't it? And then you don't care. Friedman doesn't go that far. He says, yes, you can substitute it if it has the same effects as the original thing, and you have independent arguments for that by a theory. In the end, the decision is made by the success of predictions or unsuccess, right? But you have to have an argument. So it's not arbitrary that you say, okay, I replace the leaves by the real leaves by leaves that can jump and think, right, and optimize. No, there's a theory behind it, selection theory. Same with the manager, same with the billiard player. So it's got an instrumentalist flavor, but it's certainly not fully instrumentalist. These examples I already mentioned, real thinking process by expert billiard players or successful managers are substituted by the respective rational calculations, right? It's a substitution, and of course for instrumental reasons, because they do the same job. The argument for the substitution is that the success of the actor is only explainable if it's equivalent to the result of the rational behavior. So you have an argument for that, which is also not instrumentalist. Thus, an ideal type methodology tries to be realist by targeting on the most important real factor, but is willing to replace certain possibly intractable elements by, for example, equivalent rational substitutes. That's the idea, right? You have these managers, then you say, I have no idea how they really decide, but I've got good reasons that I replace that by them being calculators, right? Doing really their economic homework and calculating, and therefore the firm is successful. So you have an argument there that's pretty close, to reality. It's not a pure instrument. So this is not pure instrumentalism. And then the question is, but still you could push that a little and say, does this move make the ideal type methodology instrumentalist? Because you're using the instrument of rationality calculated in manager, that are not there, it's not real, right? Therefore, you could say, no, wait a minute, here you become an instrumentalist. Now, in order to decide that question, because that's a question, how to decide that? Yeah, plausible, implausible. Let's look at the comparison of physics, right? Let's look what physicists do when they use the liquid drop model, right? Let's see how they treat that. Now, a physicist using Galileo's law of free fall or the liquid drop model of the atomic nucleus would not at all see herself thereby committed to instrumentalism. A physicist would never do that. The question of instrumentalism in physics, I happen to know something about that, is just a different one. If you use these idealizations, nobody can be called an instrumentalist. It's just normal procedure. All self-proclaimed realists do the same as self-proclaimed instrumentalists. They do the same. They use these examples and saying this has no implications to instrumentalism. A realist interprets Galileo's law of free fall as representing in idealized form the real force governing the free fall. Right? This is what the realist says. Yes, but it's idealized, and in physics we have to idealize. But of course we are after reality and the real forces. And the liquid drop model as a possibly temporary device that successfully approximates the real nucleus, as can be inferred from the predictive power of the model. So physicists will say, yes, that's an approximation, the liquid drop model. I know that the nucleus doesn't consist of a liquid, but it's a good approximation, and it's bringing good results. And of course, I'm trying to get the real effects of the nucleus and what it's doing. So I remain a realist, although I use, possibly temporarily, this model. It's the best we have for the reasons that Friedman has so wonderfully given. So, no commitment to instrumentalism is implied if you look at physics. No, if it's not, this is just simply not the case. Now, I don't know why economics should be different then. So if you make these replacements in the second type of assumptions, that doesn't imply that you are an instrumentalist. No, you're just using something there, you have arguments for it, and you know this is possibly not the last word, or certainly not the last word, but that doesn't make you an instrumentalist. By analogy, Friedman's ideal type methodology does not commit him to instrumentalism. This is just false, I really think. According to Friedman, the descriptively false assumptions contained in economic hypothesis concern the most important real factors of the problem situation, but in idealized and purified form, and they contain unreal factors that are plausibly equivalent with the most important real factors in idealized and purified form. So the target is always reality, right? And for this, in the second type of assumptions, you replace it, you've got good arguments for that, why you replace the real factor but another factor that's not real, but has the same effects as the real factor. So you stay a realist, and temporarily you say, for calculating purposes, this is wonderful. But that does not make you an instrumentalist, at least not in any sense that is used in the natural sciences, where it's really clear what the difference between instrumentalism and realism is. Okay? Now, both cases can be seen as making use of ideal types. Right, I explained that to you. In both cases, the identification of the most important real factor or their functional equivalents, respectively, is hypothetical and in need of empirical control. That's the idea, right? You're analyzing the problem in terms of ideal types. You may replace them, and then you know this is the situation, and then you put stress, this is the most important for a given problem, therefore I only take this one on board, and then I have to control that by the predictions that you can make. Therefore, economic hypotheses have to be tested empirically by their predictions. That's the whole idea. And these empirical tests have the final say on the appropriateness of the ideal types used in their articulation. Right? This is what also Max Weber says, that you've got to have a feel, so to speak, for the situation you are analyzing, and that feeling then leads you to the identification of the appropriate real types, ideal types, and then you write down the model only with the ideal types, and then you control whether your intuitions were right by the predictions that the model gives you, and then you say, now I know that I've really identified the relevant forces for this problem. Right? This is the analytical relevance, what he's speaking about. Right? And this is the same in physics as it is in economics. All right. Now, I got to hurry up a little because we are running out of time. And also, I will have to skip the whole section on behavioral economics, by the way, on which I did not have anything really important to say. but we come this time already to the models, and then in the end to the neuroeconomics. So I have to skip that. This has been longer than I expected. This is the first time I'm giving this lecture course. Anyway, so now this has to go fast again, revisiting the puzzling statements and facts. I said in the beginning, last session, there are many, or 2 sessions ago, there are many very strange sentences people cannot make sense of. And I told you that if you have an interpretation of Friedman, you've got to test this interpretation vis-a-vis these strange quotes and whether you can see whether they make sense under this interpretation or not. And this I'm going to do. So in short, positive economics is or can be an objective science in precisely the same sense as any of the physical sciences. Yes, this is because 53 argues that the ideal type methodology in economics has substantial parallels to the building and testing of hypotheses in physics. And I elaborated that. Friedman has only one example, and the liquid drop model is a wonderful example for the second type of ideal type, so this works, it's no doubt. The term assumption occurs 73 times in F53, but 37 times in scare quotes. Assumptions in Friedman's sense are the central topic of F53, but you've got to analyze it, what it is, and it is connected to the ideal type methodology. To call them assumptions without scare quotes is misleading, because Friedman's assumptions are contrary to normal assumptions, intentionally descriptively false, right? And this is not what you usually mean when you use an assumption. You say, oh, let's assume this and that, and then you think that's at least plausible, it's not idiotic, and then we start from there. So it's a different use of the term assumption, and therefore he uses almost consistently the scare quotes. But only of one or two papers who mention the scare quotes in Friedman's paper. And I looked at all the terms. I mean, he's got so many scare quotes. I mean, at least 200 times in the whole thing. Well, 200 times perhaps too much. But anyway, it's 100 times. So it's incredible. On 40 pages, so on every page, twice scare quotes, which means I'm using that term, but I'm not telling you what I mean, right? Okay, all right. Then the second truly important significant hypothesis will be found to have assumptions wildly inaccurate, blah, blah, blah. And in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. In this sense, which now makes sense, hypotheses are the better, the more accurately the involved ideal types identify the relevant factors of the pertinent phenomenon or make the right replacements, right? And they are wildly accurate but analytically relevant. This is the idea of ideal type methodology. So that makes perfect sense. But if you read it unprepared, you say the guy is out of his mind. The basic confusion between descriptive accuracy and analytic relevance that underlies most criticism of economic theory on the grounds that its assumptions are unrealistic. This is, of course, completely false. Ideal types have to be judged according to their analytical relevance, namely at identifying the most relevant factors. And that depends on the situation what the most relevant factors is. So this is also completely clear what he means. And then a fundamental hypothesis of science is that appearances are deceptive, and there is a way of looking at or interpreting or organizing the evidence that will reveal superficially disconnected and diverse phenomena to be manifestations of a more fundamental and relatively simple structure. Phenomena are manifestations of ideal types in many cases, not in all cases, when there are mixtures, but some cases you can analyze in there, and they're the underlying things, and they're the leading forces, right? You've got to identify them if you want to understand what's going on. There are many Popper topics in F53. Well, as the choice of ideal types is not strictly empirically controlled, strong means are necessary to test hypotheses involving ideal types by their predictions. Therefore, you need some, and he knows it, he's speculative, right? He knows, he's absolutely aware of it, therefore he needs that, therefore he was happy meeting Popper. So here's my conclusion. F53 is not at all an instrumentalist manifesto. I gotta say, I'm in a very radical minority here. Most economists and most philosophers think it's purely instrumentalist. I think this is utterly false. It is written in the same realistic spirit that most scientists share. If you talk to chemists or biologists or astronomers, most people think they're dealing with reality, analyzing reality, explaining reality. And so astronomers explain, black holes and whatever, they are out there. They're not instrumentalists at all, right? So some some, especially some physicists are instrumentalists. I talk to many biologists in my life, and they cannot even imagine why you could be an instrumentalist. Of course, the animals and plants out there, and they have properties, and we want to understand them, and evolution is real, and selection is real, and that's all real, and we analyze that. So they're all realists. So all of biology, I think all of them, more or less. Anyway, okay. Now, what is important, F53 is an application of Weber's methodological theory of ideal types, which Friedman learned from his teacher, Frank Knight, at the University of Chicago. There's the historical evidence. Assumptions in Friedman's sense are not statements claiming truth or plausibility, but they're intentionally false statements. In which sense? That isolate one particular factor, an ideal type, that is conjectured to be the most relevant one for the given problem. Well, this is what he is doing. Therefore, they are intentionally false. In order to contain the speculative excess associated with a conjectured ideal type in an economic hypothesis, a strong dose of Popperian empirical control of the hypothesis is necessary. This is where Popper comes in, right? It's much more reflected than just saying, oh yeah, he wants to assimilate economics to physics. It's much more specific, and he knows exactly where the speculative element comes in. And this is now the final thing. Since its publication, the influence of Max Weber's ideal type on F53 has mostly been overlooked, its stances has mostly been misjudged, and its sophistication has mostly been underestimated. And this is really amazing, if I'm right, that this is the central paper, methodological paper of economics of the second half of the 20th century. But this happens again and again. I warn you, this is not the first time I stumble on something like that things that are really, so to speak, classics, and then if you look closely, then you see the way this classic is treated is just a caricature, and it's not the real thing, and the real thing is mostly much better than the caricature. That's the case, I think, here in the Friedman.